It is early 1549. A 15-year-old girl sits trapped in a stone room, facing down a relentless panel of royal inquisitors. They are hunting for treason. In the Tudor court, a single misspoken word or a forced confession tying her to illegal plots guarantees a trip to the executioner's block. The target is Elizabeth Tudor. Despite her extreme youth, she meets the immense, crushing pressure of her interrogators with a terrifyingly calm composure. The officials attempt to isolate her. They pull her household staff into separate rooms for aggressive questioning, while they press Elizabeth directly for any detail regarding an unauthorized scheme to marry her. How does a legally vulnerable orphan outmaneuver the sharpest, deadliest legal minds in Europe without giving them a single usable syllable? Her survival under this interrogation is no accident. It is the direct result of a deeply traumatic childhood that served as an unforgiving training ground for political survival. 16 years earlier, in September 1533, at Greenwich Palace, Elizabeth's arrival was an immediate, profound political disappointment, simply because she was born a girl. Her father, King Henry VIII, had gone to extreme lengths to secure a legitimate male heir. He dismantled his first marriage and tore the religious structure of his kingdom apart, breaking with Rome entirely to make way for a son. When that son failed to arrive, the fall of Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was shocking and swift. In May 1536, the king turned against her. Anne was arrested on charges of adultery and treason. She was tried by a court that included her own family members and executed before Elizabeth was even 3 years old. This violence played out inside the walls of the Tower of London, a looming physical symbol of Tudor ruthlessness. Anne's death at the hands of the state established the central reality of Elizabeth's life. In the Tudor court, the closer one stood to the crown, the more precarious survival became. The state followed Anne's execution with a legal hammer blow. Parliament passed the Second Succession Act. With the stroke of a pen, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. She was stripped of her title of princess and completely erased from the line of succession, subject entirely to her father's changing whims. She was cast into a precarious dynastic limbo, a status shared only with her elder half-sister, Mary, who had suffered a similarly brutal disinheritance. Despite this legal erasure, Elizabeth's material upbringing was elite. Though her status was uncertain, she was provided with an exceptional humanist education. Under tutors like Roger Ascham, she mastered a rigorous curriculum, achieving fluency in Latin, French, Italian, and Greek. Ascham left detailed accounts of her intellect, noting her unusually quick mind, exact memory, and a capacity to grasp complex logic. This curriculum functioned as the forging of intellectual armor, training her to construct the airtight rhetorical arguments that would eventually save her life. In January 1547, the landscape shifted again. Henry VIII died, placing the 9-year-old Edward VI on the throne, while the 13-year-old Elizabeth went to live in the household of her stepmother, Catherine Parr. This chart outlines the messy legal reality of the time. While the Third Succession Act restored Elizabeth to the line of succession behind Edward and Mary, her earlier legal illegitimacy was never formally reversed. Within her new household, an immediate threat emerged. Catherine Parr's newly wedded husband, the reckless and ambitious Thomas Seymour. Seymour engaged in a pattern of predatory conduct toward the teenager, even invading her bedchamber in his nightclothes. Soon after, he hatched a treasonous plot to marry her without royal permission to seize power for himself. Seymour's erratic ambition effectively weaponized Elizabeth's own royal blood against her. His reckless schemes collapsed, dragging the teenager directly into the deadly 1549 treason investigation. Trapped in that interrogation room, Elizabeth finally deployed the full weight of her humanist training, constructing an impenetrable verbal defense. Her rigorous precision of language held fast. She steadfastly denied any impropriety or knowledge of treason, giving the inquisitors zero usable evidence, and walking away untouched. Her predator did not share her luck. Thomas Seymour was executed for treason in March of 1549. The ordeal left Elizabeth with a lasting suspicion of those who offered affection or sought influence. It proved that in her world, romantic vulnerability and political ambition were often synonymous with a death sentence. And the years that followed, Elizabeth built a fortress-like caution into her public self, masking her intentions and treating marriage and alliances as tactical tools rather than personal choices. The vulnerable, legally erased outcast of her childhood was gone. In her place stood a hyper-cautious, brilliant survivor, possessing the exact psychological foundation required to become the untouchable Virgin Queen. Henry VIII's successor, Edward VI, pushed a rigid, uncompromising Protestant agenda far beyond what his father had ever permitted. During these years, his half-sister Elizabeth cultivated a precise public persona. She dressed plainly, presenting herself as a serious, studious young woman devoted to the new religion. This carefully managed image of Protestant piety stood in sharp contrast to her older half-sister Mary, whose unwavering devotion to the Catholic faith placed her in direct opposition to Edward's court. In the spring of 1553, Edward's health rapidly deteriorated. His impending death threw the kingdom into an immediate succession crisis. These early years established the first requirement for her survival, a curated public image that offered no window into her private convictions. As Edward lay dying, the Duke of Northumberland engineered a desperate scheme to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in the line of succession. He maneuvered a Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, onto the throne, attempting to secure his own political dominance and maintain the kingdom's religious policies. The plot disintegrated within days. Aristocrats and the general public rallied aggressively behind Mary, demanding the legitimate heir take the crown. Jane Grey's brief reign ended in swift arrest, eventually culminating in her execution. With Mary now firmly in power, Elizabeth was no longer a quiet, favored royal sister. As a Protestant-leaning claimant living under a fiercely Catholic monarch, she was now the kingdom's most prominent political target. Elizabeth characteristically opted for caution. She began openly attending Catholic Mass, making a pragmatic show of outward conformity to appease the new queen. Mary remained entirely unconvinced. The two women shared a father, but their temperaments and political bases were completely opposed, leaving Mary deeply suspicious of her sister's ultimate loyalties. The tension broke in early 1554 when Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger led an armed uprising in Kent. The rebels were primarily motivated by Mary's proposed marriage to Philip of Spain, a match that sparked widespread fears that English interests would be subordinated to foreign Catholic rule. After the uprising was suppressed, investigators discovered intercepted correspondence. The letter suggested conspirators intended to place Elizabeth on the throne, regardless of whether she actually knew about the plot. Her careful performance of Catholic piety offered no protection. In a highly polarized state, simply existing as the natural focal point for the opposition was viewed as a mortal threat to the crown. Elizabeth was arrested. In March 1554, she was transported as a prisoner to the Tower of London. She entered through Traitor's Gate. It was the exact route her mother had taken 18 years earlier on her way to the executioner's block. She spent 2 agonizing months imprisoned there, fully aware that Mary's council was fiercely debating whether they possessed enough evidence to formally charge her with treason. The council found themselves paralyzed. They could find no conclusive proof linking Elizabeth to the conspiracy, and they feared executing a highly popular royal claimant on weak evidence would trigger a massive public revolt. They eventually released her from the Tower, but only to transfer her into strict, deliberately uncomfortable house arrest at Woodstock for the next year. The Tower defined her political style for the decades to come, an obsessive caution and the absolute requirement of plausible deniability in every action she took. Over the next 4 years, Mary's reign slowly collapsed. Her marriage to Philip failed to produce the heir required to secure a permanent Catholic succession. Desperate to enforce religious conformity, Mary revived heresy laws, resulting in the public execution of several hundred Protestants by burning at the stake. These extreme measures permanently hardened English sentiment against her regime, embedding a resentment in the public memory that earned her the lasting title of Bloody Mary. As the Queen's health failed, the political reality became unavoidable. Despite Mary's deep personal animosity toward her sister, Elizabeth was the only viable path to dynastic continuity. When Mary died in November 1558, the 25-year-old Elizabeth finally ascended to the throne. The celebrated monarch was the direct product of a precarious first quarter-century. Her renowned pragmatism and political mastery were the hard-won results of surviving 25 years in the shadow of the Tower. In November 1558, the English crown passed to a 25-year-old woman inheriting a realm on the verge of collapse. While crowds celebrated in the streets, relieved to see the end of a difficult era, the new government behind palace doors faced a series of crippling structural crises. The most immediate threat was the deeply fractured state of the nation's faith. Over a single decade, England had been forced by state mandate to swing violently from the strict Protestant reforms of King Edward to the bloody Catholic restorations of Queen Mary, leaving a traumatized and deeply divided populace. Compounding this tension was an empty treasury. The previous administration had left the crown heavily in debt, worsened by a costly war with France that lost England the port city of Calais, a psychologically devastating blow that ended centuries of English footing on the continent. Sitting at the center of this volatile mix was a female monarch, whose very right to govern was questioned in a society deeply hostile to the idea of a woman holding absolute power. One miscalculation, one severe policy swing in either direction, and England risked tearing itself apart in the same kind of brutal religious civil war that was actively consuming contemporary France. Elizabeth's immediate task required basic political triage, prioritizing the raw survival of the state over grand visions of leadership to stop the nation from fracturing entirely. To secure her tenuous position, Elizabeth moved first to solidify public support, staging an elaborate and meticulously planned coronation in January 1559. She understood that cultivating a visual image of undeniable, traditional authority could offset challenges to her gender. By projecting power through spectacle and symbols of state, she ensured the public saw a legitimate, permanent ruler. With the public appeased by pageantry, she turned to the actual machinery of governance. Within days of her accession, she made her most critical appointment, naming William Cecil as her principal secretary. Cecil would become her closest advisor for the next 4 decades. Their partnership thrived on a shared pragmatism and deep mutual respect, prioritizing steady administration over ideological crusades. By installing Cecil immediately, Elizabeth injected bureaucratic continuity into a government that desperately needed predictable day-to-day stability. Elizabeth secured the emotional loyalty of the populace, while Cecil managed the immense paperwork of the state. Together, they built the operational foundation required to keep the realm afloat. With a working government in place, they turned to the single most dangerous issue: religion. This graphic shows the ideological spectrum of the era, with radical Protestantism on the left and extreme Catholicism on the right. Instead of siding with either pole, Elizabeth's government placed a marker directly in the center, engineering a deliberate compromise. The first pillar of this 1559 resolution was the Act of Supremacy, which restored the crown's authority over the English Church. Elizabeth made a careful concession here. Instead of claiming the title of Supreme Head, which her father had used, she adopted the slightly softer Supreme Governor. It was a calculated linguistic shift to placate conservative critics uncomfortable with a woman declaring direct headship of the Church. The Act of Uniformity standardized theology through the Revised Book of Common Prayer. Yet this liturgy offered strategic leniency, explicitly preserving traditional elements like the hierarchy of bishops, comforting a populace accustomed to Catholic rituals. Hardline Catholics felt it went too far, and committed Puritan reformers felt it didn't go nearly far enough. But for the vast, pragmatic majority of the English population, it was entirely acceptable. The settlement held because it sacrificed ideological purity for political functionality, neutralizing the immediate threat of civil violence. With the immediate religious crisis managed, the state had to address the crushing debt left behind by the Marian government's expensive continental wars. Guided by Cecil's instincts and Elizabeth's own reluctance to spend, the Crown adopted a policy of rigorous fiscal conservatism. They cut domestic spending and strictly avoided committing scarce resources to new foreign military conflicts. Domestically, the government began assembling a coherent, albeit improvised, system of social administration and poor relief to stabilize the most vulnerable segments of society. They also enacted an aggressive monetary reform initiative to recall and replace the severely debased currency that had been circulating since the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI. Returning to a standardized, high-quality coinage was a necessary, practical step to restore the purchasing power of the English public and rebuild international trust in the nation's money. Through strict economic restraint and practical monetary reform, the new regime bought itself the financial oxygen it needed to survive its vulnerable first 1,000 days. By the early 1560s, the English government had achieved a level of structural and political stabilization that seemed nearly impossible just a few years prior. The country was not a utopia. Religious tensions from both sides of the spectrum continued to simmer beneath the surface, requiring constant management. But compared to the lethal volatility and violent swings of the preceding 10 years, this managed, quiet tension represented a massive feat of governance. The state had been secured through 3 distinct practical measures: the careful cultivation of public image, a deliberately compromised religious settlement, and unrelenting fiscal restraint. In securing the immediate survival of the state, Elizabeth and her council forged the specific, pragmatic architecture of statecraft that would hold the realm together for the next 45 years. 16th-century monarchs faced brutal realities, but Elizabeth I faced one unique to her. She took the throne as an unmarried woman. Immediately, her council and parliament pressured her to take a husband. They demanded an heir to secure the line of succession and stabilize the realm. In this era, a female monarch without an heir was viewed as a severe national vulnerability, rather than an independent ruler. Looking at this contemporary map of London, the dense, walled city mirrors domestic political pressure, with factions tightly clustering around the crown. Beyond those walls, down along the Thames, foreign courts saw her single status as an invitation to absorb England into their empires. For the young queen, finding a husband was framed as a prerequisite for England's survival. Marrying an English noble would destroy the domestic balance of power. Elevating one family over the others would incite jealous factionalism and risk civil unrest. Marrying a foreign prince carried its own flaw. Doing so risked turning England into a subordinate puppet state answering to a hostile foreign empire. Added to these political dangers was Elizabeth's personal history. She had watched her father execute her mother, Anne Boleyn, and later her stepmother, Catherine Howard. The experience of her adolescence with Thomas Seymour left a deep-seated reluctance toward the institution itself. Yielding to the pressure to marry would mean surrendering her kingdom's autonomy and her own security. There was one domestic prospect. Robert Dudley was Elizabeth's childhood friend and her closest favorite. Throughout the early 1560s, they conducted their mutual affection with public intimacy, unusual for a monarch. This intimacy generated persistent court gossip and diplomatic speculation that the Queen intended to marry him. Then, in September 1560, Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the foot of a staircase under circumstances that remain ambiguous today. The scandal fueled rumors that the death was orchestrated to clear a path to the throne. Though an inquest returned a verdict of accidental death, the sheer weight of the suspicion made Dudley politically untouchable. This tragedy proved a domestic marriage based on personal feeling would invite suspicion and delegitimize the crown. Realizing an actual marriage was too dangerous, Elizabeth and her chief advisor, William Cecil, pivoted. They began to use the illusion of marriage as their primary diplomatic tool. This map illustrates how Elizabeth dangled and withdrew the prospect of her hand to manage relations with France, Spain, and the Habsburg territories. She extended matrimonial interest according to English foreign policy, keeping enemies off balance and preventing any empire from uniting against her. For over 20 years, the mere promise of the Queen's hand provided a more effective defense for England than a standing army. The most sustained foreign negotiation involved Francis, Duke of Anjou, brother to the French king, beginning in the late 1570s. Elizabeth showed genuine affection for him, evidenced by her fond nickname for him, her frog. However, the English public and Parliament reacted with visceral hostility to a Catholic French consort. The backlash reached extreme levels when John Stubbs published a pamphlet opposing the match. By royal order, Stubbs had his right hand amputated. The violence of the state's response mirrored the intensity of the public's opposition. The Anjou match ultimately collapsed in 1582. Any marriage, whether domestic or foreign, would inevitably plunge England into chaos. By 1582, Elizabeth was approaching 50. Her biological window for producing an heir had closed, and the Anjou negotiations were over. With the marriage game finished, Elizabeth faced the ultimate crisis of her reign's identity. Elizabeth redefined her single status, presenting herself as a monarch symbolically wedded to her kingdom and her people. She leaned into the state-sponsored construction of the Virgin Queen persona. In this portrait, her immaculate clothing and composed expression signal purity and imperial control. Her permanent single status was no longer a political delay, but a sacred element of her reign's identity. Notice the details in this later painting, the rainbow portrait. She replaced a male consort with semi-divine symbolism, positioning herself as the nation's mother. Her artists wove specific iconography, like eyes and ears, directly into the fabric of her clothing, projecting an image of total omniscience over her subjects. This image was reinforced across the realm through poetry, ceremony, and public art, until it became unassailable. This period of English stability was secured by a queen who systematically ignored the conventions of her era. By the end of her life, Elizabeth had turned the political burden of her singlehood into her administration's greatest asset. She used her image to bridge the gaps where a husband and heir should have been. In the autumn of 1586, the English Parliament cornered their queen. Following a treason trial, lawmakers aggressively demanded the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. This handwritten document is the actual death warrant they prepared. Despite overwhelming pressure, Elizabeth I fell into agonizing hesitation, refusing to finalize the process. The physical ink from her pen was the only remaining hurdle between her cousin and the executioner's block. The Queen of England spent nearly 20 years dodging this exact piece of paper. She feared the geopolitical fallout of killing her rival far more than she feared the prospect of her own assassination. The origins of this crisis stretch back 18 years, to 1568, when Mary abruptly fled a collapsing reign in Scotland and crossed the English border to seek Elizabeth's protection. She arrived carrying intense controversy. Mary abdicated following the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley, pictured here, and her rapid remarriage to the primary suspect. But her presence carried a severe legal threat. As the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, she held a direct, undeniable blood claim to the Tudor crown. For Europe's Catholic powers, Elizabeth's parentage, born from an annulled marriage, rendered her illegitimate. In their eyes, Mary was already the true, uncompromised Queen of England. This created a trap. If Elizabeth executed a fellow anointed monarch, she would shatter the sacred precedent of royal immunity that kept her own head on her shoulders. But allowing Mary freedom guaranteed a Catholic uprising. The English council settled on an anxious middle ground. They placed Mary under a highly restrictive, roaming house arrest, bouncing her between remote English estates for nearly 2 decades. This prolonged captivity resolved nothing. It left Elizabeth's security advisors terrified of an escape, and it left Mary naturally desperate to secure her freedom. By simply living under English guard, she became the permanent, undeniable focal point for domestic rebels wanting to topple Elizabeth's Protestant regime. These conspirators rarely worked alone. They consistently secured vast financial and political backing from Catholic Spain and the powerful Guise faction in France. The strategy of quiet containment failed entirely. Mary mutated from a desperate political refugee into a highly active magnet for international treason. To counter this, Elizabeth's principal secretary, Francis Walsingham, built a sophisticated intelligence network to monitor the shadows of the kingdom. His mandate was clear: map and dismantle the Catholic conspiracies, systematically neutralizing elaborate threats like the Ridolfi and Throckmorton plots. Rather than rushing arrests, Walsingham relied on intercepted correspondence. He allowed clandestine letters to flow, secretly copying their contents. In 1586, during the Babington plot, he sprang the trap. He patiently monitored the letters until possessing actionable, irrefutable proof. The intercepted replies proved that Mary had direct personal knowledge of a coordinated plan to assassinate Elizabeth and had formally approved it. Walsingham's intelligence network eliminated the ambiguity that had paralyzed the crown. He forced Elizabeth out of her 20-year stalemate, handing her the exact legal justification needed for a treason trial. Returning to February 1587, the agonizing pressure finally broke Elizabeth. She signed the death warrant, but immediately attempted to stall, ordering her secretary, William Davison, to hold it. Her counsel made a desperate rogue countermove. They pressured Davison to forward the warrant immediately, explicitly acting behind the Queen's back before her conscience could intervene again. On the 8th of February, 1587, inside Fotheringhay Castle, the action became irreversible. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. The immense pressure of state security overrode the monarch's personal dread. Elizabeth's men had permanently crossed a line of royal precedent. When the news reached London, Elizabeth reacted with explosive fury and genuine grief, immediately imprisoning the secretary who had forwarded the warrant. Historians continue to debate her response. Was it calculated, plausible deniability to appease Europe, or the profound moral terror of a monarch who knew a sacred boundary had just been destroyed? The immediate domestic calculation proved correct. Striking off Mary's head permanently removed the greatest internal figurehead for Tudor rebellion. But the external cost was catastrophic. Killing a Catholic monarch shattered the final deterrent keeping the continent at bay. This engraving illustrates the immediate consequence. Mary's death provided King Philip of Spain with the ultimate geopolitical trigger to launch a holy war. Barely a year later, the sprawling military retaliation known as the Spanish Armada would set sail for the English Channel. The signature Elizabeth spent 2 decades avoiding finally solved her longest-running domestic crisis, only to plunge England into the most dangerous international conflict of her reign. In the summer of 1588, an existential threat bore down on the English Channel. A massive fleet of over 130 Spanish ships sailed toward England, carrying orders from Philip II to overthrow the Protestant queen. Elizabeth I responded with a public display of defiance at Tilbury. She famously declared that while she possessed the body of a weak and feeble woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king. This rhetoric defined the popular historical memory of the event, a providential underdog victory where plucky English sailors saved the kingdom from certain conquest. However, the tactical success in the Channel did not end the Anglo-Spanish War. The celebrated victory was actually the opening chapter of a 15-year war of attrition, a conflict that would push the English crown toward financial exhaustion. The victory of 1588 proved to be a masterful exercise in public relations, even as it pulled England into a grinding, multi-front war that would consume the remainder of Elizabeth's reign. Philip II's decision to launch his fleet followed years of mounting tension as the two kingdoms drifted from cordial relations into a cycle of direct provocation. Throughout the 1570s and 80s, English privateers like Francis Drake conducted aggressive raids against Spanish colonial shipping. Elizabeth's government extracted the plunder while maintaining official deniability for what was effectively an undeclared maritime war. The conflict escalated in 1585 through the Treaty of Nonsuch, where England committed an expeditionary force to support Dutch Protestant rebels fighting against Spanish rule. Already antagonized by these proxy wars, Philip II reached a breaking point with the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, an act that triggered his direct military response against England. Philip's fleet represented the culmination of decades of English hostility, the final inevitable retaliation in a long-simmering cycle of covert and overt conflict. During the initial engagements in the English Channel, the English fleet relied on a tactical asymmetry. They utilized smaller, faster ships equipped with longer-range artillery to harass the tightly packed Spanish formation from a distance. The turning point came off the coast of Calais. A decisive English fireship attack broke the Spanish formation, forcing the Armada into a disorganized retreat northward around the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. This forced journey home proved more destructive than any naval engagement. A series of severe autumn storms wrecked dozens of Spanish ships against the rocky shorelines. Ultimately, the weather was responsible for the loss of half the fleet and thousands of lives. The English government immediately capitalized on this luck, interpreting the destruction of the fleet as a sign of divine favor for the Protestant cause. Despite the losses of 1588, the war continued in a prolonged and largely inconclusive fashion throughout the 1590s. Subsequent English naval expeditions against Spain were far less successful, failing to achieve a decisive blow against Spanish power. On the European mainland, the ongoing commitment to the Dutch rebellion became a continuous and exhausting financial drain. The naval superiority displayed in the Channel offered no advantage here. The conflict was a grinding war of fortifications and logistics that absorbed vast crown revenue. The tactical brilliance of the naval battles could not resolve the resource-heavy demands of this protracted proxy warfare. In the final decade of Elizabeth's reign, the financial situation reached a breaking point due to a substantial uprising in Ireland led by Hugh O'Neill. This rebellion, shown across these provincial borders, was heavily supported by Spanish forces, creating a costly secondary front that the English crown struggled to contain. Suppressing O'Neill's uprising absorbed an ever larger proportion of crown revenue, resulting in significant financial strain across the kingdom. This period of heavy taxation and bureaucratic struggle is far less celebrated in memory than the dramatic victory at Tilbury. Elizabeth's masterful rhetorical strategy successfully secured her legacy as a legendary monarch, but historical analysis requires us to look past the gleaming optics of the Armada myth to see the expensive, crippling reality of practical governance. The middle and later decades of Queen Elizabeth I's reign saw an explosive surge in English literary and cultural achievement. The professional London theatre developed at a breakneck pace, driven by the early stage works of playwrights like Christopher Marlowe and, soon after, William Shakespeare. Alongside the stage, poets like Edmund Spenser released sprawling allegorical works like The Faerie Queene, explicitly celebrating the Queen under the guise of Gloriana. This cultural high watermark and the semi-mythic persona of the monarch did not happen organically. It was a deliberately constructed, fiercely protected public facade. Outside the walls of the London playhouses, the reality of the state was entirely different. Compounding crises were pushing the nation to the brink, starting with a rapidly surging population that traditional systems could not feed. The royal treasury was being heavily drained by the massive military expenditures required to fight a sustained war with Spain and suppress an ongoing, bitter rebellion in Ireland. This chart tracks a secondary crisis across Europe. A massive influx of American silver crossed the Atlantic, driving skyrocketing domestic inflation. Adding a second metric for the declining purity of English coinage shows how currency debasement compounded that inflation, wiping out average purchasing power. A starving population, a drained treasury, the state should have collapsed. So what hidden machinery of power kept the illusion of a golden age intact? Overseas exploration during this era is often remembered as romantic adventure. In practice, it was a pragmatic, urgent economic expansion designed to keep a strained crown financially afloat. Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 was a highly lucrative maritime raid. Elizabeth personally invested in the venture to secure foreign wealth, knighting Drake on his deck upon his return. But relying on privateering and colonization carried enormous risk. Walter Raleigh's attempt to establish a settlement at Roanoke in the 1580s failed completely, absorbing capital with zero return. To solve the capital crisis more reliably, the government shifted to a corporate strategy. They chartered joint stock companies, like the Muscovy Company, allowing private investors to take on the financial risk of monopolizing new trade routes. The ultimate culmination of this strategy arrived in 1600, when the Crown issued a royal charter to the newly formed East India Company. By delegating global expansion to private companies and state-backed privateers, the government generated the essential capital needed to fund the military and maintain the prosperous image of the state. Behind the Queen's mythic public persona sat a tight, fiercely loyal network of capable ministers who quietly managed the grinding realities of the realm. Francis Walsingham developed a vast, ruthless intelligence network stretching across the continent. His agents intercepted communications and disrupted Catholic conspiracies before they could threaten the throne. The administrative anchor of this system was William Cecil, the Lord Burghley, who oversaw the endless daily bureaucracy required to keep a 16th-century government functioning. As William's health began to fail in the 1590s, the levers of administration were seamlessly handed down to his son, Robert Cecil, keeping the engine running without interruption. Sustaining this small circle of trusted counselors across 4 decades provided the government with deep institutional memory. That administrative stability prevented political collapse during years of mounting crisis. Domestically, the greatest threat to stability was a rising population straining traditional systems of poor relief, exacerbated by a string of brutal harvest failures. The government responded systematically. Decades of policy refinement culminated in the Comprehensive Act for the Relief of the Poor in 1601. This legislation engineered a massive logistical framework, forcing local parishes to tax themselves to administer social welfare to the destitute. While the lower classes were managed through parish logistics, the elite class was managed through scarcity. Elizabeth avoided summoning Parliament unless she was entirely desperate for military taxation. When she did summon them, she masked her financial desperation with highly calculated rhetorical theater. In her 1601 Golden Speech, she bypassed policy entirely, making a sweeping emotional appeal directly to her subjects' love and loyalty. Social welfare laws and soaring political speeches served the exact same function. They were pragmatic, administrative tools deployed to manufacture loyalty and maintain order in a highly fractured society. The final years of Elizabeth's reign were characterized by profound exhaustion, physical, financial, and national. Despite the commercial victories at sea and the theatrical achievements in London, the deep strains of the Spanish War and the Irish Rebellion remained brutally unresolved. The period concluded as a masterpiece of crisis management that only barely held the state together. The glittering myth of Gloriana died with Elizabeth in 1603. The pragmatic machinery her council built to support her did not. The 1601 Poor Laws survived, with modifications, to become the basic structure of English social welfare for the next 2 centuries. And the 1600 Charter of the East India Company laid the irreversible groundwork for centuries of future British global expansion. The true triumph of the Elizabethan Golden Age was the ruthless, enduring machinery of power that allowed those cultural achievements to exist in the first place. In 1588, the English Navy crushed the invading Spanish fleet, securing the nation's borders and creating a powerful national myth. Contemporaries and historians alike have pointed to this victory at sea as the absolute climax of Elizabeth I's reign. But this line graph tracks the English royal treasury in the years following that triumph. To sustain the ongoing multi-front war with Spain, the state drained its reserves and entered a deep, continuous deficit through the 1590s. At the same time, a devastating series of agricultural failures swept across the country. The resulting harvests yielded so little food that localized social uprisings broke out across rural districts. The final decade of the celebrated Tudor era was characterized by severe economic exhaustion and widespread domestic suffering. As the national treasury emptied, the Queen also lost the veteran circle of ministers who had managed her government for decades. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, died shortly after the Armada's defeat in 1588. Her spymaster, Francis Walsingham, followed in 1590. The heaviest blow arrived in 1598, with the passing of William Cecil, Lord Burghley. He had been Elizabeth's closest advisor for 40 years. Without the generation of men who had helped build her state, an aging Queen Elizabeth was left entirely reliant on a much younger, highly ambitious, and far less disciplined cohort of courtiers. Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, quickly filled that political vacuum. He was a charismatic young soldier who secured a place as one of the Queen's closest late-life favorites. Elizabeth developed a deep personal affection for him. She consistently overlooked his impulsive behavior and showed an uncharacteristic tolerance for his outright insubordination. That tolerance was tested in 1599, when Essex was appointed to lead a major military campaign to suppress an ongoing rebellion in Ireland. He mismanaged the operation entirely. Rather than engage the enemy decisively, he negotiated a highly unfavorable, unauthorized truce with the rebel leader, Hugh O'Neill. Abandoning his command without royal permission, Essex rode back to Nonsuch Palace. He forced his way into the Queen's private dressing chambers early in the morning, confronting her before she was fully dressed. This severe violation of court protocol immediately destroyed his standing. By invading her private sanctum, he shattered the carefully maintained image of the monarch's untouchable authority. Stripped of his titles and facing total financial ruin, Essex was banished from the Queen's presence. Driven by desperation and paranoia toward his political rivals, he attempted to orchestrate an armed uprising in London in February of 1601. The rebellion lasted only a few hours. The citizens of London completely ignored his calls to mobilize, and loyal royal forces swiftly surrounded his men. Essex was immediately tried for treason and sentenced to death. Contemporaries noted that Elizabeth found the decision to sign his execution warrant deeply painful, given the profound affection she had held for him. His execution represented a pattern that defined her 45 years on the throne. Whenever personal attachment conflicted with the security of the state, she sacrificed her own desires to eliminate the political threat. Over the following 2 years, the Queen's physical health went into steady decline. Her deterioration accelerated under the weight of compounding grief, culminating in early 1603 with the death of Catherine Carey, the Countess of Nottingham, who had been a close companion since childhood. By March of 1603, courtiers reported that she was severely depressed and physically exhausted, stubbornly refusing to retire to her bed for extended periods. She died at Richmond Palace on the 24th of March, 1603. She was 69 years old and had governed England for nearly half a century. Because she maintained her refusal to marry and left no direct heir, her final breath marked the permanent end of the Tudor dynasty. A chaotic power struggle was only avoided because Robert Cecil had spent months carefully executing secret negotiations with the Scottish court. The crown passed quietly to James VI of Scotland, the son of the executed Mary, Queen of Scots. He became James I of England, uniting the two crowns and beginning the Stuart period. He inherited a kingdom burdened by staggering financial debt from decades of warfare, along with unresolved religious tensions. Yet historians weigh those massive debts against the reality of her youth. She began her life disinherited by her father, imprisoned by her sister, and lived under the constant threat of execution. From that starting point, she enforced a religious settlement that prevented full-scale civil war, successfully defended the island against the largest military threat of the 16th century, and presided over a cultural expansion that produced Shakespeare. She navigated the intense challenges of exercising sole authority as a woman in a deeply patriarchal age. The costs to her personal life were absolute, but she built the most enduringly celebrated reign in English history.